Is now just 4 days away from its first government default in history, and there's a range of ways that could impact Hawaii residents if Congress fails to increase the debt limit, according to the Houston Chronicle. Now, there would be higher interest rates, a plunging stock market, prices of imported goods would soar, federal highway and mass transit aid would stop, and chaos at the airports if the government cannot pay for security screeners. And that's just to name a few. Now, this morning, the University of Hawaii Economic Research Organization says Washington is ignoring the real crisis. And joining us this morning is UHERO Executive Director Dr. Carl Bonham with more. Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us, Carl. Now let's talk about Governor Abercrombie first. He's convened an emergency meeting of his cabinet members to deal with this crisis. What can the state do at its level because of a potential budget crisis here in the islands?
Well, basically what they're trying to do is really figure out a cash flow problem. There are federally supported expenditures, Medicare, Medicaid, that the state pays on a monthly basis, and if the federal government stops providing the money, the question is how do we sort of bridge that time period? And as long as any kind of postponement or slowdown in federal money coming into the state is short term and it only lasts a few months, this is useful planning. The real problem would come from the overall effects of a default. Maybe not quite as extreme as what the Houston Chronicle is talking about, but rising interest rates and things like that. Now,
you believe that Washington lawmakers are ignoring the real crisis, and that's a further slowing of the U.S. economy. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, we got new numbers today from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. They gave us the advance release for the second quarter U.S. real GDP. So that's the total output of the U.S. economy, and we already had a lot of monthly data on jobs and retail sales and so on that told us that the U.S. economy was slowing. Well, what they did was they told us it was slowing quite a bit. And the first quarter was revised downward. So basically the first half of this year looks very, very weak. We got growth in the second quarter of 1.3%, first quarter of only 0.4%, and the recession was much worse than we originally thought. So the real problem is the economy is not going anywhere and we're not creating any jobs. That's the crisis. Right. The debt ceiling is an artificial crisis.
But there's this huge blame game in Washington right now. You've got the Republicans, the Democrats, the Tea Party. People are blaming the president. But shouldn't the lawmakers really be focusing on improving the economy?
Right. And the plans aren't, all the plans that are being floated will hurt the economy in the near term. And so they're really making things worse rather than making things better.
So what about longer term then? How should they deal with this, impending crisis?
Well, first of all, they need to raise the debt ceiling. They created that crisis by refusing to raise the debt ceiling without cutting spending. Okay, that's not a prerequisite. It's not in the Constitution that you have to cut spending in order to raise the debt ceiling. So that's an artificial crisis that they've created. And then they need to have a deficit reduction plan that goes out long term and actually addresses the structural deficit. In other words, it addresses the entitlement programs. And neither of the plans that we have from the Senate or the House deal with that.
Well, Carl Bonham, I know that we can ask you a lot more questions because I know this controversy is continuing, and I know that some of the people who've been following UHERO can follow you on Facebook as well, so we'll continue that discussion there. Dr. Carl Bonham from UHERO, thank you so much for joining us. And don't forget, if you'd like to see this interview again, you can head over to the morning section of our website, KITV.com.